It may take decades, step by step, brick by brick, calloused hand by calloused hand, but it can be done.
The following segment is brought to you in partnership with Future 42. Simon, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brandi. Appreciate it.
Yeah, let's talk about the election first. You lost.
I did.
By
That's
not
right.
very much.
That's right.
How do you feel about that?
Well, the old saying is that what is it? Close only matters in horseshoe and hand grenades.
My dad used to say that all the time. Yeah.
And that's sort of how it feels. We ran a really, really hard campaign this year, and I think we were expecting, obviously, to win. We always acted like we were behind, and we ended up not quite making it across the finish line. And I think we're going to delve into some of the reasons for why that is. But yeah, it really is disappointing. I think I still feel like I'm the luckiest person on earth, having gotten the chance to represent my community, a town that I grew up in, and to get to fight for them down in Olympia. I was obviously hoping and looking forward to getting to go down there for the next 4 years and get to do that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the beauty of our process is you fight hard, and the people make a choice. And at the end of the day, you accept the results, you move on, and that's the beauty of our system.
It's kind of an odd question, but obviously you were appointed to fill the seat that Doug Erickson held before he passed away. Did you feel any sort of extra pressure to keep that seat given the fact that Doug died?
Yes. I think there was definitely and to be vulnerable, one of the hard parts, I think, of the failure was feeling in some ways like I let down the family, and that I let down a conservative legacy there, because I really would like to think that if Doug were looking down, he would have wanted somebody to champion some of those principles of limited government down in Olympia. And so, that part definitely stings. And then, of course, it stings knowing, it's not just that I ran, it's the fact that I was appointed, sort of the incumbent, that I worked with some of the state senators down there. I got a little taste of sort of what the process is like, and in my opinion, the need for sort of new leadership and a new voice. So in some ways, I'm more cognizant of what I'm missing out on, which I think obviously also makes it a little bit more difficult as well.
But at the same time, you're still 22, right? You told me when your birthday is. It's before Christmas.
Correct. Wow,
right?
Good memory.
Is it the 23rd?
December 21st.
Oh, so close.
So,
okay, I'll remember that now.
Quite impressive.
Thank you. Well, we just talked about it. And so, I mean, I was doing keg stands at the University of Nebraska at 22.
Yeah.
And you were a state senator. So I imagine that a future political run is still very much on the table for you at 22.
Yeah, I never rule anything out. I think we'll just have to see sort of what the future holds. I think my focus right now, again, it's funny, you put all this effort, all this time, all this money into it, and you're either faced with having a job for the next 4 years or being unemployed. And so I'm still sort of focusing on the immediate next steps. My plan, as I think I told you before all of this, was potentially to go to law school, and that's still something that I have a passion for. So we'll see about that, but I definitely know that there's a real... I'm really passionate still about local politics, and so we'll see what happens in the future.
So I invited you here to talk really about the future of politics in general and your generation, how active they are now versus how active they perhaps should be or could be. But reflecting on the November election, do you feel like your defeat was as much sort of this general Republican poor performance, or do you think it was your race specifically?
Well, I think any candidate that says, that it was all the fault of some general wave isn't being honest. So I'm not one of the people that says there was absolutely nothing that could have been done different. I'm very self-critical, and I think there are steps that we could have done that could have brought us across the finish line.
Like what?
Different types of, for example, outreach. And specifically, and I think this is something that I should have done in my race better, that I think the Washington State GOP, I think even the national GOP needs to sort of consider. And it's the way we do our messaging partly. There was a total sort of schism if we look at the average Democratic mailer, the average Republican mailer in this election. And it was sort of interesting that the Democratic side was talking about abortion, and then they were talking about sort of using moral phrases, if that makes sense, defending democracy, protecting democracy. And our mailers were sort of about, the economy and inflation and crime. And that's not to say those aren't things, and I do want to talk about specifically the economy aspect too in a second, but there was sort of I think the Democrats did a better job of capitalizing on sort of moral language that the Republicans didn't use. And quite frankly, I think that works because ultimately Americans are hopeful people, and people want to go to the ballot thinking that they're voting to preserve democracy, whatever that may mean.
Moral language or fear, though? Because to me, the preserving democracy was fear-mongering.
It was. No, and I mean, I absolutely think, especially, again, in the state of Washington, if this was a different sort of state, different sort of race, some of these things would have been more fair. But I think at the very least, we can still capitalize on the use of defending democratic principles. I mean, in my opinion, the whole emergency powers debate is exactly a debate about democratic principles, a limited government, a balance of powers between the executive and the legislative branch. And so we can still use that sort of language. But I think this, in some ways, was a message that we cannot just win elections if we just focus on pocketbook issues and public safety. We have to have a broader vision and not just be reactionary. Now, how we do that is a whole nother sort of discussion, but I think it's sort of a recognition that, again, all the pollsters sort of that we talk to on our team, and I think the other Republicans you'll probably talk to will say the same thing, told us that if we focused on crime and the economy, that would bring out a different result. And by the way, none of this is to say, of course, that those aren't important issues. I still do think crime and the economy are probably, the most important issues. But that message just didn't resonate with voters this year.
Almost like it needed a more cohesive call to action to say, and that's kind of what they were doing. So in a way, you're saying that Republicans were out-campaigned.
I think so, and the economic part, is worth touching on partly just because, and I saw there was an economist, I think, out of California who talked about this, but quite frankly, the economy probably hasn't gotten bad enough to make it enough of an issue for voters to vote on. Even though inflation is at a rise, unemployment hasn't, risen to the levels that it has in the past that typically causes these sorts of swings. We still have a lot of stimulus money, several $1 trillion that are sort of trickling through the economy that have sort of offset some of the inflationary effects we're seeing on the economy. And so I don't think it had the same effect that some of us were expecting that it might have. And then, of course, it's worth noting, I do think at some level the Republican Party did just mess up on some of these things. You covered it earlier, but I mean, the Secretary of State race, for example,
right.
A Republican who was in there, and then we don't even have a Republican coming out of the primary election because we can't even get on the same team with each other. And then, as you covered, and I don't even really know a ton of the dynamics of that race, but I think the bottom line is the Republican Party in some ways with that sort of race did make some mistakes, in my opinion.
Yeah, and then the 3rd congressional district, it's like you had a seat that Jamie Herrera Butler could have kept easily, no question. Yet you have this division in the party that was like so petty. They're like, we'd rather give that seat to a Democrat than let her keep it for voting to impeach Donald Trump.
Right, and of course you're going to have people argue all about that race because you're going to have the establishment people say that it's because, you got somebody that just basically got referendum on that one vote regarding Donald Trump. And then you're going to have sort of the anti-establishment wing say, well, it's because the establishment didn't support our candidate enough against Guzman. So, it's you're going to have these debates go on and on and on. But I think everybody should recognize at this point that we need a new direction.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of it is hard for Republicans, and we'll talk about this when we get into kind of future and some issues I think are going to be make or break for the Republican Party and its continued viability in our state. It's like, I would like to see, for instance, on Trump.
Yeah.
It's like this, like wishy-washy, like we're not really going to commit to any sort of opinion on him. And we know that Trump had a piss-poor approval rating in Washington. It was like low 30s. And Democrats will make every race about Donald Trump. And it's very effective for that reason. And yet you still have the state Republican Party who, they don't want to anger some part of the base. And so they want to try to play this middle ground that I don't find effective. Do you feel like it's time for the Washington State Republican Party to have a clear stance on Donald Trump? Or is that a weird thing to ask of them?
It's one of those, it is a weird thing to ask of them if, for example, Donald Trump became the nominee in 2024. Right. You pretty much always expect the state party to support, the established candidate there. There is no denying that regardless of anybody's views on Donald Trump, he has not been particularly popular in Washington State. And I think, we're seeing the effects of that. I looked at some data in my district, the 42nd district. There was a state representative who won that seat in 2016 by 11,000 votes. By the midterm year, 2 years later, he lost that seat. More than an 11,000 vote swing because I think of the unpopularity of President Trump at that time.
Well, and that's why I think that they just need to, and I would hope the National Party would recognize the position that Trump puts certain state parties in, like ours. I have heard from some Republicans who in 2024 are hesitant to run because they know if Donald Trump's at the top of the ticket, they'll have no chance in the world. And I already think Republicans here are verging on no chance in statewide elections, if we're not already there. And so if just for, because I think of it as prioritizing policy above politics. Like, I get it that you don't want to alienate, or the Republican Party, it's odd for them to come out and say, we don't support Donald Trump. Like, he's just not the fit for our state. But then you're just going to lose. And wouldn't you rather be in a position, even if you anger some people, to have candidates be elected and in a position to influence policy? Because at the end of the day, that's what should matter to me. So I think that distancing yourself from Trump for the state party would ultimately get more people elected and make a bigger difference, because then you're actually in a position to influence policy. So I understand the difficulty for them, but I just think the survival of the state party here would depend on it.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would add there is I'm not sure as much that the state party tried to make this election about Trump, in any state, at least the GOP
Democrats?
did. But the Democrats did.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And when you have a media, an establishment media that does cater to that so many times, it makes that job difficult. And so in some ways, again, that's the nature that the Republicans are fighting an uphill battle in the state, because it's not just the two parties versus each other. It is the sort of media establishment that makes an election about Donald Trump when he's not even on the ballot.
Oh, 100%. And what I'm saying is Democrats come out, no shame. Tina Polidowski, it doesn't matter if you've said 150 times before that you don't like Donald Trump. She'll be like, that's a Trump Republican.
Right.
I mean, look what they did to Tiffany Smiley.
Yep.
And so for Republicans to not have a forceful, cohesive response to that, I think was a mistake, because it's so predictable that is like Democratic playbook here, number one. And there just wasn't a good sort of pushback for that. The other issue I thought Republicans really failed to be coherent on is abortion. And you and I have talked about your stance on abortion, but do you feel like as a whole, the Republican Party should have been more prepared to answer questions on abortion?
Yes. And this is, that's why the political industry is so interesting, because again, you spend millions of dollars and then at the end you realize, things should have been different. Right. And so I think there was sort of a mentality that if you're talking about abortion, you're losing. And so you address it and then you pivot as quickly as you can to crime, to the economy or something else. And I think we saw, that we should have had a more proactive message about that. Now, I'm still not sure how much of a difference it would have made, because I think the bottom line is we just saw a lot of people show up in this election, specifically on the Democratic side, that were going to vote for a Democrat because that's automatically what they associate the abortion issue to be about. And so, I'm not even sure how much nuancing you could have done even in this cycle, but certainly I think there should have been more proactive messaging, and folks simply got it wrong in that regard. And that would include, I think, our campaign.
Well, and I'm not even saying like that you have to be dishonest about your opinion on abortion, but Tiffany Smiley, for instance, she should have had her message on abortion ready the day that Roe was overturned. Instead, they allowed Patty Murray to spend millions of dollars over the summer painting Tiffany Smiley as this anti-choice extremist. And she did not get her message together until after the primary. And then she came out with what I think is a great message, which is, hey, I'm pro-choice, but I'm not going to overturn the will of the voters in Washington State.
Pro-life, yeah.
Or I'm pro-life, but I'm not going to overturn the will of the voters in Washington State. That's what Democrats do, not Republicans. And so she said, I'm not going to vote for anything that would codify it nationally or anything that would ban it nationally, because Washington voters have made up their minds. That's effective. But you waited 6 months too long to vocalize it. And you said you think your campaign made a mistake on abortion. How so?
Well, I mean, just in the quick pivoting, and I think the Republicans pretty much in all these swing districts did so, but sort of this idea that you acknowledge it, say it's unlikely to change, and then move on to talk about, crime and the inflation in the economy, because, sort of some of the messaging that was provided was, this isn't going to change in the state, but what can change are, our policies regarding public safety and the economy. All those things are true, by the way, but that message just didn't, I think voters still wanted more of a direct answer, and that wasn't necessarily provided to them.
Yeah. So as I'm sure you've heard, the U.S. Senate passed codified same-sex marriage into law. And it was a bipartisan basis, 12 Republican senators. I don't know if I've ever asked you your stance on same-sex marriage. Have I? Where do you stand on same-sex marriage?
I'm trying to remember. I feel like in our very first interview.
Maybe. Remind me.
I think that, so I haven't looked into the specifics of I think it's called the Defensive Marriage Act. My understanding is that there are some groups that have concerns about the religious liberty and employment sort of aspects to the statute. But overall, I think that it's something that is the law of the land in Washington and the country ever since the 2015 Obergefell decision. I don't anticipate that changing, and I think that makes sense. I think people should have that choice in this country.
I think it bothers me fundamentally that it's even still an issue that's at play. And this is one of those things where I think GOP moving forward, especially in a state like Washington, I want them to move on from the social issues. I want them, and I know that, and I'm not saying you can't have, like, you're pro-life.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people can't have deeply held beliefs on traditional marriage, on abortion. But to me, those beliefs that are often based in religion shouldn't carry over into the political realm, in my opinion.
Right.
And I think, and you can disagree with me, that it is a losing proposition as your generation grows up and takes over to continue to litigate same-sex marriage and abortion. Do you agree?
I agree. It's so first, it is important to touch on what you just said, which is people in my generation, quite frankly, are I think one of the reasons that there wasn't a red wave in 2022. And the data is showing from you can fact check me on this later, but I think what I saw was Generation Z, basically people my age, outvoted people over the age of 65 for the first time in history in this cycle. And their top three issues when polled: abortion, climate change, gun control. If those are your top three issues, you're probably not going to be voting for a Republican. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
And of course, I don't think those should be the top three issues. I think if you're a young person entering America at this point, you want to be able to gain equity through buying a home and all those sorts of things. But the bottom line is that's not how people in my age group feel. And so, I do think that we have to connect to those young folks in a different way. Otherwise, I think that these red waves are simply not going to happen. It's also worth, I read something from the Northwest Progressive Institute last night that basically said...
Northwest Progressive Institute, bless your heart, doing a little opposition research.
I mean, I always like to get both sides' opinion on what went well, what went right in this election. And they, I think, correctly pointed out, they think that Republicans overplayed themselves by all this talk of a red wave. That... it basically deterred Republicans from showing up to vote. Meanwhile, the Roe-vember sort of stuff ended up, really getting people on the Democratic side to show up. And so I think we also just have to be careful about basically making prophecies that end up hurting us.
Yeah, and also polling. Like, if there is not some sort of substantial mea culpa and change in the way that polling happens in this country, I don't know how any media outlet takes those polls seriously. But look at Tiffany Smiley. They had that
Trafalgar poll, I think, that had them dead even, or something like that.
And even Real Clear Politics called it a toss-up in the final days of the campaign. And one of the things that really stunned me about that is the polls were very consistently increasing in Tiffany Smiley's favor. So it wasn't like some situation where it was like this.
Right.
It was like, okay, this
she's
is believable.
gaining ground.
Because she's gaining ground slowly. It's obvious momentum. and she lost by double digits. So to me, the polls need to stop factoring into any candidate's perception or any party's perception of where they might stand at any given time, unless the pollsters come out and say, we're totally revamping things.
Agreed. And I think some pollsters are doing that. I mean, one of the things, again, that the reason I brought up the Generation Z thing, people my age aren't responding to poll. We don't respond to polls. We might maybe respond to like a text message poll, but it's pretty unlikely. And so that's why I think some of these polls underestimated Generation Z, because the polling groups are off. But also the way polls are done, typically phone calls, which gets like less than a 1% response, isn't going to be super effective. I've seen some polling companies that are apparently sending like $5 in the mail. And if you fill out the poll, then you get $30, and that has like a 5% response rate, And so polling has to be majorly redone. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that, and this happened in 2016. It was sort of corrected some in 2020. But I mean, polling, I don't know what to believe about polling, whenever I hear somebody talk about it.
Yeah. So this segment we're doing is part of my partnership with Future 42, which is really about this effort to sort of bring the state back to a point of semi-balance in the interest of how our tax dollars are spent, in the interest of public safety, and really building a state, you mentioned it earlier, where everyone in Washington can build a wonderful life here. And I really believe Washington, it's the most beautiful state I've ever been to. We have so much potential here as far as our economic strength and prosperity. And I see so much of that being squandered by Democrats that it's unreal. And so in terms of the future of our politics, if you could kind of look in your crystal ball and see where Washington you think will realistically be in 20 years, if we continue on this trajectory that we're on, what do you think the future looks like for balance or for divided government or differing points of view?
Quite frankly, not good. I mean, right now, the other thing I want to touch on briefly that feeds into this is, the Clyde Shavers race. Yeah. As much as I feel bad about losing my race, the irony that we get from the Democratic Party in Washington is anytime, that there's a slightly controversial Republican, the Washington State Democratic Party just comes down on people. Why aren't you willing to call out this fellow Republican who's doing such and such? Mm-hmm. And what have we heard on the Clyde Shavers race? Silence.
Crickets. Oh, he learned from his mistakes.
I mean, come on. That is the most sort of hypocritical, just, baseless thing I've seen recently. But unfortunately, I think it speaks to the hyper-partisanship that we are seeing, and I'll probably say on both sides in many regards across the country. But when you have people that either didn't know and voted for him anyways, purely because of the letter behind his name and an establishment that won't back down, that's a problem. And so my fear is that from this election, the Democrats are going to be even more emboldened to continue down the wrong path, that we're going to be sort of followed down closer and closer to where Oregon and like Portland is. And then hopefully there'll be a course correction at some point. The thing that Washington State has that other states don't is exactly what you mentioned. We have a naturally beautiful area. We're still very high demand. In my district, there's still a lot of folks that are migrating down from Canada, a lot of East Indians, for example, that still want to live here and they can afford it. And so the economy, I think, can afford, unfortunately, to get a bit worse before you're going to have that massive course correction. The unfortunate thing is, in the meantime, a lot of people are moving. I mean, anybody that's watching or listening to this right now can probably think of people right now that have left to go to Idaho or Tennessee or Florida. And so we're going to see even people that have grown up here leave. And I think we're still, from some of the migration patterns, going to see people coming to the state. It's still going to be in high demand, but it's not going to be sort of at the balance that it should be.
What do you think it would take? If we're talking about purely to get people from your generation to vote for Republicans, or even moderate Democrats, even people who are going to be fiscally responsible, care about public safety in a genuine way, what do you think needs to happen? What could the party do?
Well, what needs to happen overall and what the party could do, I think, are two different things. Okay. Because partly, our public education system, I think, both at the higher ed level and K through 12, are failing students right now, oftentimes focusing more on, quite frankly, making activists out of students rather than educating them.
I agree.
And so, that revelation is nothing new. I'm not saying anything particularly unique there, but it has to be noted that, one of the reasons Generation Z's voting the way that they are, make no mistake, is because of the higher ed and public education
They're
system.
raising future Democrats.
Right.
I really believe that, yeah.
Exactly. And so that's why I've joked, like, if you want to be a rebel nowadays, be a Republican, know. And then secondly, I think the media establishment has to balance out a little bit. I mean, just overall, both across the country and in Washington, there's still so much of a liberal bias in the media that it makes, again, if a Republican had pulled a Clyde Shavers, the coverage would have been absolutely different, but it wasn't.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, some mainstream did cover it, but not with the
not with the vitriol,
Right.
that you would expect out of a story like that.
And I should just note, if people aren't familiar with the Clyde Shavers, he ran in the 10th, was it the 10th or the 11th?
Yeah,
10th legislative district as a Democrat. For some odd reason, lied about his military service, even though he didn't have to. He served in the Navy, but he made it seem more impressive than it was. And then he lied about, which this one I cannot wrap my mind around, said he was an attorney when he hasn't passed the bar.
Right.
Sort of like, we can check on those things, right?
And it was so bad. Those lies were revealed by supposedly Clyde Shavers' father,
Right.
who reached out to the media and said, basically, my son is lying to you about these things. That's a pretty bad, but again, absolutely crickets from, the Democrat Party and for the most part, the media in terms of the way they've typically covered it. Yeah. So those institutional things need to change. But in terms of what the party can do, I don't disagree with you probably that a more winning strategy would be, to step away from a lot of these, high sort of tagged social issues that get put on. Again, I think sometimes those things are unfairly put on because of the way the media sort of forces it on Republicans and on the political area. I think, quite frankly, we do need younger, more dynamic candidates, and clearly I didn't win, and so that's not exactly saying all the time that we have to do that. But I think ultimately we have to do a better job of finding candidates that can connect to new people in new ways. I mean, one of the things I tried really hard to do in my race, for example, was, I knocked door to door in my area with campaign literature that was in English, in Spanish, and in Punjabi. And reach out to new demographics. I went to a lot of Sikh temples, and worked with new groups in different communities because partly, I think our ideas are the right ideas and they work for all different groups. But secondly, the GOP has just historically done a terrible job at reaching out to new demographics and new groups, and we cannot expect to win if we're going to, keep playing to the same people.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed, though. They had more so than any time in my recent memory, Republicans in our state had a really diverse field of candidates. They had candidates of color. They had a lot of women who didn't win and who were vilified. I mean, there was one woman who ran, I believe it was down south, who she was totally and falsely accused of being anti-abortion. And she came out and was even saying, like, that's not true, and telling her story. And they still continued to paint her as anti-abortion. And so you had these women, people of color, who were just vilified in the same way by Democrats and who weren't able to make it through their campaigns, which I thought was disappointing. And I don't think the GOP got enough credit. For as much as people are like, it's the party of old white men, it's like, well, where was the media coverage showing the really diverse field of candidates that the GOP put forth this time, to your point about the media?
And that's where I say that's one of those. I mean, that's where this specific year, 2022, I think was just one of those things with the Dobbs decision.
Yeah.
50-year precedent of Supreme
Right.
Court decision, the Roe decision getting overturned is just one of those sort of bellwether things that's going to just, unfortunately, capitalize so much that people at some level, I think, went to the polls not even caring who the R was or who the D was, but they knew they were voting for the D, and it could have been somebody like John Fetterman, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And it doesn't matter.
Yeah, people were, Republicans were like, oh, we hate Patty Murray, and Democrats were like, oh, we hate Tiffany Smiley. I'm like, at least our options weren't Mehmet Oz or John Fetterman.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was the funny thing. I had a Thanksgiving dinner with some friends that were Republicans. And the thing that I did ask them though is, okay, as much as it is easy to complain and criticize, people for voting for John Fetterman. And let me be clear, I don't think Dr. Oz was the right choice at all.
Yeah.
I think two poor choices for that state. I think there's still a lot of Republicans that if their candidate in that race had gotten the stroke, still would have voted for the Republican simply because he's a Republican.
100%.
So, as much as I think Republicans are complaining about like, oh, you voted for, Fetterman. I think if Fetterman were the R, so to speak, had the R behind his name, I'm not sure that it would have been that different in some ways.
We also know that the bench I think that candidate quality is a huge issue.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we didn't have some good ones, and I understand why candidate quality isn't where it could be, because you have people who are smart, functioning adults who look at the current political climate and they're like, hell no.
I'm out. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely not. And I don't blame them for that. And so I think part of it is having to get it back to a place where like we can all be adults and have adult conversations and disagreements and work actually for the people who we're supposed to be working for. But for your generation, do you have a lot of friends who share your political beliefs?
Yeah, I do.
Do you have a lot of friends who are in their 20s?
Yeah, but I play video games with them. I don't necessarily or like go to the gym with them. I don't necessarily like talk politics a ton. But yeah, I have, and I think they're like, I want to be clear that as dreadful as it sometimes sounds about Generation Z, I think there are a lot of young people that actually maybe this counters your point a little bit, but I think it adds a little bit of nuance. While it is true that the Republican Party is getting hit for sort of focusing on the culture war, the Democratic Party oftentimes sort of does the same by going to just absolutely crazy levels with sort of the pronoun nonsense or, that sort of thing, to where like the average person is sort of, when they feel like they're getting just forced all the time to buy into this gender ideology.
Even young people, you feel like?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like they just want to, go hang out with their friends, do sort of normal things, not being told that they're evil because they're white all the time or that they have to abide by, their friends' pronoun. Just those sorts of things that I think really do sort of, even people that are fairly like apolitical, they feel like the Democratic Party's gone way too far with some of those things.
Yeah, I am hoping sometimes when I'm on the TikTok? What is the other one? The Snap chat?
Yikes, this isn't... Snapchat,
sometimes those videos,
TikTok.
they get posted to Facebook where I see them because I don't have the other apps. But I feel like, and maybe even younger than you, are having a little bit of a libertarian bend where they're just like, screw authority, like we're done with all this nonsense.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of like an independent streak that I'm kind of watching and hoping that things get so, their whole lives, they've grown up in this heated, awful political climate.
Yep.
And I'm hoping it kind of wears them out to the point where they're like, we need to start over, or we need to rebel in some way.
Yes, I think that's very true, and yeah, I think there are a lot of young people that just feel tired on both sides of everything, but not tired in like that they want to entirely exit the system, but that they know they want something else, something different, even if they don't know exactly what that looks like yet. Although you did just remind me, another thing I have to complain about briefly is Republicans also sort of played themselves with all of the election integrity stuff.
Oh yeah,
I
terrible.
mean, the amount of constituents in my district that told me sort of either beforehand or afterwards that they didn't vote because they know that the other side is cheating. I mean, there is not, and again, the funny thing to me is like this is just something that entirely was the fault of the Republicans in that sense of like, the easiest way to convince somebody not to vote in the first place is to try to convince them that the entire system is rigged, which is what we did to ourselves, and then stopped people from showing up to vote. And then in that case, the other side wouldn't even have to cheat theoretically because your own side isn't showing up enough. And so, that was just another example of just shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, it's self-destruction. And I said over and over, the only way for sure your ballot is not going to be counted is if you
don't
not
vote.
Turn it in. Like, even if you think they're going to cheat with it,
go ahead and vote anyways.
Is that any worse than you leaving it on your counter? The outcome is the same.
Right. Like,
right?
what are you proving to them?
Right.
Is the person rigging the election really looking and saying, oh, so, that group didn't vote. They really got me.
Yeah.
No, they're glad. They don't want you to vote.
Yeah.
Whenever you feed these sort of election things, every Democrat that watches that and listens to that gets very, very happy when we play ourselves with stuff like that.
100%. It just plays into it. I guess for people who are watching, who are disappointed in the way that November turned out, and who are wondering, I think rightfully so, what does the future look like for the Republican Party? Can they ever win a statewide office again? Can they ever take back the state house or the state senate? What would you say to people who are feeling a little frustrated and feeling a little like giving up?
Well, first of all, I know how you feel. As somebody that poured my heart and soul into a race that came close but not close enough, I understand that sentiment. And to me, I think it's a reminder that things are not hopeless. I do not think we should give up in any sense. I think, in fact, I've joked before, if I could run again right now, I probably would. But the question is, we have to be smarter and even more diligent than we were in the past. And, I look all the time. Florida, even like 10 years ago, was more considered a blue state than it was a red state. And, Florida's completely switched. And we're seeing, Oregon is actually becoming a little bit more red. California is becoming a little bit more red.
Republican almost won the governorship in Oregon. I was shocked.
Republican, I actually thought Drazen might, win. And I think a Republican seat flipped this year for a Republican against a Democrat in Oregon. And so we are seeing in some states, that are getting more and more red. But I think we really do have to go back to sort of and you know what? Maybe this isn't popular. This will get me in trouble, but we need to have better candidates for the governorship than the Lauren Colps of the world.
Oh, I agree. You won't get in trouble here. I'm sorry, Lauren. I know we've had a fine relationship.
If that gets taken somewhere, and that it plays well on the east side of the state, but you cannot win, with a candidate like that in Washington. But I think this is definitely a moment where we have to do some real soul searching to determine what the future is. But all of the time, Democrats have flipped solid red Republican states, and Republicans have done it to other states as well. It may take decades, step by step, brick by brick, calloused hand by calloused hand, but it can be done. But it will take a lot of different approaches, I think, than what we've had.
I think Simon Sefzik for governor 2040, 42.
No. You can give it a go here in the next 2 years or 6 years, and we'll see how things go.
Yeah, I'll let you know how that goes. Well, my only question for you is, why are you so smart? Where does that come from? Like I said, I was just deep in partying in college at 22.
It was because I didn't discover those things like TikTok and Snapchat until later on in life. Yeah. So I got some baseline of intelligence before I let the rest of my life get wasted on social media and all those other things. But no, I don't think, I think the best advice I've received all of this year actually came from the Lieutenant Governor, Denny Heck, a Democrat who I think, was elected, he told me at the age of 24 years old.
Oh, okay.
And really nice guy, even though we probably have our fair share of political disagreements. But the advice he gave me, he said, you have a very important job and you are not a very important person. And, that's the way I try to look at this whole thing is, and I'm about to go down to Olympia sort of for the final set before the term ends, basically. And to me, it's just I still pinch myself to say this is a really special opportunity, but it's not because I'm special. And, if anything, I've come away from this experience while I'm sad, it's just increased my natural curiosity for the world, for so many things. So I guess I reading good books and having good conversations, has always served me well, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's a great piece of advice for anyone from Denny Heck. He is a nice guy, and
yes.
I'll have to take that one to heart too. So Simon Sefzik, I know this is not the last that I'll hear from you, and I appreciate you coming in and having a conversation about the future of our fine state. This segment was brought to you in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org.